Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the last session of the Fiscal Forum entitled Boosting Investment in People and Infrastructure. I think if a journalist was writing a headline, they'd say, how to build a better world without going completely bust. Because what we're talking about this morning is really how to square a very difficult circle. On the one hand, it's very clear that investment in infrastructure, both tangible and intangible, is badly needed to cope with climate change, to boost growth, to counter inequality, to cope with the digital revolution. But at the same time, looking to the government to do that is very challenging these days because debt burdens have exploded across the world in the last 10 years. So what we're going to be looking at in the next hour is how do you actually get that infrastructure investment without blowing the budget? Do you do it by raising taxes? Do you do it in partnership with the private sector? Can you use efficiencies in investment? How do you actually have effective corporate governance? How do you actually deliver in a practical way? And we have a terrific panel of people to talk about this. I won't do lengthy introductions, but very briefly, we have Pascal Donoghue at the end, who of course is the Irish Finance Minister. Next to him, we have Vera Songwe, who's with the United Nations and in Africa. I'm just trying to load up my notes. Next to that, we have Nicolas Duchovny, who is the Minister of Finance in Argentina. We have the MD, Christine Lagarde, and we have Gloria Alonso, who's Director of Planning in Colombia. And I'd like to start, please, with Christine Lagarde, the MD, to tell us how the IMF is currently seeing this challenge and how you try and square this extremely difficult circle.
Well, as is often the case at the fund, we try to start with numbers. We believe that what is driving the need for infrastructure investment is exactly what you've indicated. Climate change, poverty, people, and technology, and that requires these investments in both tangible and intangible. And I would like to just have a little caveat on that one, because I often have that debate with some countries that are in fiscal surplus, which we encourage to invest. And they say, well, I've invested everything, so infrastructure is fine. Infrastructure is fine, but you sometimes have to maintain your infrastructure basis, and that is also needed. So we start with numbers, and what we are seeing and have seen for quite a few years now is a clear shortage of public investment on the part of the advanced economies. When you look at the numbers, we're talking about an average of 1.7% of public investment, which is twice as little as what it was in the 90s. So while some of them might argue that a lot has already been done, we believe that 1.7 is on the short side of it. And that combined with the smart way of investing and managing efficiently projects, which maybe we'll come to in a little while, we believe that there should be a clear focus. I would add, and that applies to particularly the advanced economies, and I'll come to the emerging and developing countries in a second, is that currently financing such investments, it's not exactly the highest possible cost given the interest rates and the debt service cost that there is, which is not to say that we encourage any kind of investment, but the investment with the right focus on the right project, properly managed, is probably at an ideal point from a market perspective. Now, in terms of emerging and developing countries, there is also a crying need for infrastructure investments, and we know that the human dimension of it and the people focus that there should be about it should be on the agenda. So we are trying to develop tools in order to help those countries actually manage as best as they can their investment in those projects. We're trying to support as much as we can through the use of tools like PIMA that are being used in some countries, and through support to all those countries, how they can be most attractive to private sector investment, because we do not think that the answer to those needs is of a public nature, it will require participation of the private sector, and as such, and as we know from what the investors are telling us, there has to be macroeconomic stability, there has to be a business-friendly environment, and there has to be stability for them to actually come and invest.
Right. But before I turn to Minister Duchovny, I want to quickly ask one thing. You say that the developed countries have 1.7% of their GDP being invested at the moment, which has fallen in recent years. What would be your ideal target for how much should be invested on the behalf of the government? And we're sitting in Washington, where the idea of the government doing anything is wildly unfashionable. How would you answer your critics who would say, why should the government be doing this rather than private businesses? I was actually asked.
Oh, this was full of you.
Yes, yes.
I thought you were asking Nicolas to address that question. So the bottom line is, why should the public invest?
Why should the public invest?
Well,
and
the public,
if 1.7 is too low,
yeah,
what should the number be?
Well, we never set standards because there is no one-size-fits-all. But what we know for sure is that it's very much on the low end. And it's not as if there was a reduced need of infrastructure, including in the advanced economies. So what we're suggesting is that efficient investment be concentrated on where there is need, in particular for those sectors or those long-term investments where the return is not necessarily going to attract a lot of private sector. When you look at, for instance, the labor force and the investment in people, those are not, typically the toll bridge, the railroad, or the airports that you naturally think of, and which is often thought of in emerging and low-income countries. But in those advanced economies, there has to be that kind of investment. In emerging and developing countries, the same is true. And you're not going to attract necessarily, although there are some examples to the contrary, but you're not going to attract a lot of private sector investment in those fields of education, of lifelong training cycles that are so badly needed. So this is clearly investing in the sort of very soft infrastructure that will be badly needed as we're going through the technological transformation that we're going through. And if these investments are not materializing in all countries, then the benefits that could be reaped from those technologies will simply not happen. And there will be more people that will be excluded out of transformations that are underway.
Right. Minister Duchovny.
I knew it would come to you.
Exactly. Okay, now I am asking you the question. So in your presidency of the G20, Argentina has put the issue of infrastructure investment very much at the center of the global agenda. Why?
Well, for many reasons, but first because we think that putting investment at the center is key in a way to generate economic prosperity and economic growth. So that's the most important reason. Second is because it coincides with the agenda of our administration. Argentina found when President Macri took office that our infrastructure was depleted during many years. So we had to rebuild our infrastructure, and that led us to think how to do that. So we were thinking on that before our G20. Third, we find that it's not only a theme of emerging markets, it's a theme that is very transversal to all economies, in which we find that there's a very big deficit in infrastructure investment, that you can put figures which are very difficult to take into concrete terms, but maybe 15 trillion is the deficit of investment that is needed in the next
50 trillion.
$15 trillion
right,
in the next 20 years or so. And on the other hand, we see that there's an enormous pool of liquidity, especially real money investors, very long-term investors, which have more or less 80 trillion in liquidity, of which whom a very tiny part is devoted to investment in infrastructure. So that's why we decided to make steps at the G20 so as to bring those issues together, the infrastructure deficit and the ample liquidity to finance that. So we decided to move into the first steps to create the infrastructure investment as an asset class. So we take a look at the experience of the emerging markets in the 80s when the financing from developed nations to emerging market economies was very disorganized. And then we saw the appearance of the emerging market bonds, a very liquid bond that emerged as a new asset class, very liquid, that enhanced the possibility of receiving financing by the emerging market economies. So the roadmap towards generating something similar in terms of infrastructure financing should be started. It will be a long process, but we wanted to kick off, and we are very happy to see that Japan, which is using quality infrastructure as one of its priorities, is including the continuation of generating infrastructure as an asset class as one of the issues, one of the topics. So at the end of the day, in some years, we will see the results, and we think that that will be crucial to see a boost in investment all alongside the world.
Right, right. Now, Gloria, Colombia is being held up as a very interesting example of how investment in infrastructure can work in reducing poverty. What has Colombia done recently, and what are your big challenges in terms of infrastructure?
Thank you. Actually, yes, Colombia has been doing a really great work by reducing poverty. Almost during the last 2 decades, we have reduced poverty for more than 23 percentage points. But this is even an important challenge because still we have more than 70% of population in poverty, more than 3.5 million in extreme poverty. So the challenge is how to deal with our budget in a more efficient way, how to deal with the population that even we have been having this important social transformation. So now the problem is now not only how to cover the 100% of population that we are almost done, but the most important thing is now how to improve the budget, how to give the quality in the expenditure, how to give quality in the health service and in the education for the population. This is an important issue. This is why we call like a kind of how to do the social modern policy, not just to cover, but also to improve the quality in the public services. This is one of the important issues. The other one is that, as many of the countries, we have been having this transformation in our demographic structure. So the population is getting older, and we have to rethink the subsidies in order to attend this kind of population that is the most probably to get back to the poverty until if we get a shock in our economy. So we have to rethink the subsidies, the public policy in that sense, in that way. But always the challenge is how to provide a good administration of our budget in order to cover the population in the efficient way. And this is just to investment in people, but also we have to invest in infrastructure, as you mentioned. We thought that Colombia needs more an investment in infrastructure, like around 8% of GDP. And we have seen that an enormous gap between the regions, between the center and the region, the periphery, and we have really a great challenge to close that gap. Not just because of the infrastructure, in investment in infrastructure, physical infrastructure, but also in social infrastructure. So we need to be smart enough to attend these gaps, to close these gaps, to work with in the regional capacities, in the how to improve the knowledge and the capacity in the regions, not just for investing, because we need to connect our regions, as we used to say, but we need to connect our regions, we need to connect our people to the market, and also we need to connect our budgets, just the central budget and the regional budget. We need to connect the governments, because in that way we will be more efficient to assign and to direct the budget in the way that the population needed, and in the way that it should be more efficient to close the gaps.
Right.
So this is the way.
Okay, well, thank you, Director Alonso. I'm going to come back and ask you more questions about that in a minute, but first of all, Pascal, Ireland cut its public investment quite sharply after the financial crisis for obvious reasons, and yet you're now talking again about how to embark on a new round of investment through Ireland 2040. Can you tell us about that, and why 2040?
So what we're
why not 2050 or 2030?
Because what we've tried to do, Gillian, is put together a plan for the kind of population growth that is going to happen in Ireland, that's going to peak across the period as we approach 2040. And as you have correctly said, when Ireland was going through its many economic difficulties, we made the choice to either restrain or cut back capital expenditure. We did that for two reasons. The first one is that the level of economic activity in Ireland obviously contracted very, very sharply. So there was less of a demand upon the infrastructure we had then. And secondly, we made the call to look to protect a number of areas of current expenditure that we felt would be important for maintaining consensus in Ireland and support for our citizens as they went through a period of real economic difficulty. And underpinning Ireland 2040, I guess, is three different elements that, in fact, all of the different speakers have touched upon in their own way. The first one is what we're trying to do is have a longer term approach to how we manage capital expenditure. Because what we've done, Gillian, is we've been at a certain level of expenditure one year, it's fallen the next, it rebuilds again. And we're looking to give certainty to the private sector, to state bodies, regarding what kind of resources they'll have available in 5 years, for example. The second thing that we are doing is integrating that into a planning framework for our country, so we can integrate how we spend money with how we can respond back to a growing and changing population. And then finally, we're very open about acknowledging that within local government and central government, we don't have all of the answers. So we've created a number of funds where we're asking communities and the private sector to come to us with their ideas, and we look at how we can co-fund them. And a really interesting theme that I've heard each speaker touch upon is the concept of intangible infrastructure and social infrastructure, which I think is a really interesting way regarding how we have to think about infrastructure, that it's more than just our roads, our ports, how we can invest in our schools and our universities. It's also about new forms of infrastructure that are harder to see but so important to help, in particular, open economies and open societies respond back to globalization, to the changing nature of globalization, and to the great challenge of technology and the disruption that that brings. And I think for all of us, that's a new agenda that I think we have to think carefully about how we respond to.
Right, right. Vera, last of all, I realize I introduced you wrongly. You're actually the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, based in Africa. So you're looking at how this is developing on the ground in terms of the infrastructure needs. Over the last few decades, whenever infrastructure has been talked about in Africa, it's often been about mobilizing international aid. What is your thinking about where infrastructure investment is going now? What are the priorities and how will it be financed?
Thank you, Gillian. I think what are the priorities? We have, I think, an amazing international framework now for priorities, which is called the SDGs. And the SDGs lay out, I think, for us, a very nice set of priorities. And so I think we heard the MD sometime this week saying, don't go out and do another strategy, just take the SDGs. And I fully second that. However, when we look at the SDGs and we cost them out, we know that it costs about $680 billion for Africa to be able to sort of meet the SDGs. And I think combining the discussion a little bit on social infrastructure, at the Economic Commission for Africa, we've just done a piece on health. And it costs about $60 billion to be able to sort of meet up every year the health expenditure gaps on the continent.
$60 billion every year.
$60 billion every year, in particularly when we start talking about maternal care and the cost of that. And so, but then you go backwards and it costs another $80 billion for energy infrastructure, and then there is another $60 billion for ICT infrastructure, and you can just unpack those numbers. And so when we ask about what the priorities are, I think it varies by country. Some countries already have 75% access to energy, for example, on the continent, Kenya, Senegal, and a few others. And therefore, I think that there's more of a focus on maybe the health infrastructure. And then, of course, sort of getting up to speed on the digital space and ensuring that you have enough of the digital infrastructure to make Africa leapfrog. Many other countries, and I think this is the important dichotomy now on the continent, is that we do have a number of developing countries that have done quite well on the infrastructure front. We have about 20 countries that have gone to market, and so they can crowd in private capital. Yeah. But there is another set of countries that are much low-income countries that do not have access to the markets, do not have any ratings, and so must fall back to depending on, I think, the most important and the most basic of private capital, which is tax revenue. And essentially, governments need to do better than crowding in better and more tax revenue. At the Economic Commission for Africa, we have just done a piece that looks at, how much can we raise in tax revenues on the continent. Today, tax revenue to GDP is about 15%. Total government revenue is about 25%. When East Asia was growing at 8–10%, and the overall economies of the world were growing much faster than, East Asia was at 35–40% tax revenue to GDP. So we still have a 10% gap. The good news is that we actually can do better on the continent if we just broaden the tax base, if we use technology to be able to increase our tax revenues. We have countries like Rwanda, Benin, South Africa that have shown us that with digital technology you can do a huge jump and a huge boost. So some of that, our report shows, so you need $680 billion for infrastructure. If we improve revenue collection, we can actually close the gap by about $400 billion. So it's a huge amount, and that includes broadening the base, reducing tax incentives. It's a huge, huge issue. We need to sort of level the playing field, give less tax incentives to our businesses, elicit financial flows, ensure that our mining companies, our commodity companies pay the right taxes, stop base erosion and price shifting, which is another huge outflow of revenue from on the continent, and I think that if we can manage that. And finally, moving towards more countercyclical fiscal policies, which is essentially spending less when things are going well and spending a little bit more when things are not so good. And when you put those 5 packages together, you begin to get a sense of where we're going. So each country can pick 1 or 2 of those priorities. So there's not one size fits all. For the low income countries, we will still need to strengthen the tax base and then eventually go out and raise more capital. And finally, we do talk a lot about crowding in private capital from outside, but when you start looking within the continent, there is a lot of domestic savings that is not being mobilized towards investments. A lot of it is in the pension funds that sit on the continent. I think that in most African countries we have huge state pension funds. And I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done to see how you can translate those pension funds and insurance funds. And so, for example, in Kenya, they have about $30 billion of domestic capital that has not been used and applied for better infrastructure. So the question is, how can you crowd that and blend that with sort of foreign funding to ensure that you can then get infrastructure that is funded in a way that is acceptable? We will never be able to get foreign funds and private capital to go to the villages because the rate of returns just does not exist. And so I think we will always need to have the state as, you know, a funder. And in the SDGs, we always talk about sort of leaving no one behind. If you need to leave no one behind, the state needs to play that role of ensuring that we close the gap between the rural and the urban areas.
So you're really talking a lot about homegrown solutions, yes.
Can I echo what Vera is saying? Because this is music to our ears, as you know, and as we both discuss on a regular basis. But the point you made about, first of all, plurality of financing sources. The donors will continue to have to be at the table. It's not a question of moving entirely to domestic revenue mobilization. They will have to be at the table. Private sector will have to be brought to the table when it's not coming. And clearly international institutions have to participate. But you said exactly, you know, what is needed in terms of domestic revenue mobilization. The Fiscal Affairs Department under Vitor leadership has actually done enough calculation on the basis of only 5 of the SDGs to actually identify how much additional fiscal resources will be needed in 2030. We're talking about an average of 15% of GDP, and that goes from
50% of global GDP.
One five of those countries' GDP that will be needed in 2030 in order to finance only 5 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So that's a huge amount, and there's no question that it will require everybody. Because while we've calculated, correct me if I get that wrong, that pretty much each and every country in sub-Saharan Africa can increase its debt, its tax to GDP ratio by 5%. But that's only a portion of the answer. It's a critical one because you mentioned the good cases.
Exactly.
You mentioned Benin, you mentioned Rwanda, and they've gone up big way. But you know, I don't mean to be offensive, but there are several countries, including some very large ones, where the tax to GDP is minimal and where there has to be a massive increase in order to move up in the direction of creating some self-sufficiency in terms of financing. And for that, you know, we all think that a medium-term fiscal plan is what is really needed. You can't just assume that one government for 1 year is going to make the right decisions. It has to be a medium-term commitment.
But in reality, even if you have better homegrown solutions in terms of more tax, in terms of more efficient spending, mobilizing domestic pension money, that will still not be enough. You're still going to need to tap into the global pool of private sector capital. How realistic is it to do that, and what needs to happen to make that happen? I know that Minister Duhovne, you've been championing the use of private sector money for meeting the SDGs. Are you satisfied with how things are going?
Well, I think that there's still a very long way to go because we think that there's still many impediments to channel funding for infrastructure. The first one is the lack of a pipeline of bankable projects. So that's very, very important. Then there's a lack of standardization between projects. So that was what I was mentioning before. We need to standardize projects and contracts. In order to do that, we need to improve data. So pure data is another impediment to improve the way in which infrastructure is financed. Then the current mitigation schemes are not conducive to mobilize private capital. And I would say that another very important point is the underdeveloped capital markets, and that's particularly in emerging market economies. and you will find there many problems. One is the lack of local currency financing, hedging, how to use local currency into long-term contracts in countries, especially with still high inflation, like the case of Argentina, but even in cases of mid-range inflation, is difficult to use local currency, and if you want to hedge, then the costs are going to go up. So we think to address all these issues. As I mentioned before, this will take a lot of time, but I think that, well, we started, and that's a very important departing point.
Minister Donoghue, I mean, is Ireland using private sector money to finance some of your infrastructure? Are you doing PPPs, public-private partnerships, or things like that?
Yes, we are indeed, and we'd use a mixture of different funding techniques to deliver important projects. During our periods of economic difficulty, the role of the private sector, the role of really important institutions like the European Investment Bank would have played a very, very important role in Ireland. We continue to have a very good relationship with that organisation. Given where we are at the moment, my view is that I will decide on a project-by-project basis what is the right funding technique for either a form of capital investment or indeed a particular project. And I think the question you posed to us earlier on regarding how we can mobilise private sector investment, I think is a really important one, because we're all aware of the funding gap that we will have to realise the challenge of the Sustainable Development Goals. And some of the things that I'm learning within Ireland and I'm learning inside Europe that I believe will matter more in the future will be firstly the role the state plays in influencing pricing decisions within our economy. So in particular the role of carbon taxation in influencing investment decisions across the economy. And secondly, as the Managing Director said there a moment ago, trying to deliver policy certainty that goes beyond an individual government. And that is why the role of our regulators in particular is so important, because if investors feel there's certainty in their decisions, it can play a really valuable role then in mobilising the private sector to combine with the work of national governments or the role of European institutions. But we're learning much as we go along. I mean, this is a very, very demanding journey. And in the last number of years, we've learned in Ireland from things that haven't gone as well as we would hope.
Also, I mean, give us some examples. Are there things you've learnt about what not to do?
Yeah, of course, you've always lots of learnings from, you try to avoid kind of making the same mistakes again in relation to, how you use money, how you invest for the future. Two learnings that I think are relevant to our experience. The first one is sharply cutting back on capital expenditure during a crisis period can actually create further challenges for you in the post-crisis period, because you find yourself then trying to catch up really, really quickly, which generates many, many challenges in relation to inclusivity and your society. And in particular challenges that we would have in Ireland and in Europe in relation to housing and in relation to how we can support economies outside of our big cities, I think are examples of that. And then I think the other learning that we've had then is how we can continue to challenge ourselves regarding efficient use of public expenditure. And I think the work of the IMF, the PIMA technique, and all the work that you can help us with, I think is very, very valuable, particularly if you're rapidly increasing capital expenditure, to ensure that you don't sacrifice efficiency as you're looking to play catch up. And I think there are two learnings that we've had. Of course, there's many things that you think you do well, but of course you always want to debate what you do wrong and what you can learn from us. And there are two areas that I think are important to us.
Right. I'm going to ask in a moment about the question of governance and project selection and monitoring, but before I do, Director Alonso, in Colombia, have you financed your infrastructure primarily through public sector spending money, or have you tried to use the private sector money too?
Actually, we have been doing both, but I think that Colombia is one of these cases that is characterized because of his economic soundness. Maybe this is the most important thing to attract investment in a long-term way, because it's not just to attract investment for a short term and then it can go away. So in that sense, it is important to mention that in Colombia, we have been working for more than 2 decades in this economic soundness. We have these 4 pillars I can mention. We have this monetary policy by inflation targeting. We have been having our fiscal rule and fiscal sustainability issue as important issue to attend the public sector in a responsible way. Also, we have been having this important financial regulation to support the financial sector, to support or to give the confidence to private sector that this is a serious country to invest. So in that way, Colombia for a long time has been having responsible governments to attend, to protect these important pillars in the macroeconomic sustainability way. So for me, this is the most important issue, to attract private investment, and we have been doing that, and we have been developing different kind of tools to attract investments, like PPP and other issues. But also, I think that the institutionality is also important. The department that I'm the head, the National Department of Planning, has an important issue, which is to plan in a long way the investment, not just the social, but also the physical investment that is needed in a long term. So, of course, there is a lot of room to improve, to do the design of the social, especially the social investment. As I mentioned, we reduce the poverty, but now we need to think more in a smart way how to attend the new necessities of the population. But also we need to improve the productivity issue, to invest more in infrastructure, and to attend the necessities of the rural areas in terms of infrastructure investment. So in that way, if we are able to convince the private sector that this is a serious country that manages in a serious way its macroeconomic in a stable way, we are able to attract long-term investment, and not just for social, but also for physical investment. So This is an important issue.
Well, certainly the fact that Colombia has cut poverty by such a remarkable amount while being fiscally prudent and sufficiently credible to attract outside investment is a very cheering example of progress. But Managing Director,
I could not resist, Gillian, because you mentioned the macroeconomic soundness and stability of Colombia. I have to do a bit of advertising here, because that country has the benefit of a flexible credit line, which is a financial instrument of the fund, which is actually available to protect against external shock when the macroeconomic stability of a country is sound, solid, and on a regular basis. So it's a product that is actually reviewed on a regular basis and only renewed if there is such macroeconomic stability. It's just been renewed recently for Colombia, which is facing massive inflow of refugees from Venezuela and the hardship that has a fiscal impact on you. So
yes, that's true. Thank you.
what about corruption? What about governance? Because talking about public-private partnerships, talking about government infrastructure spending has often been controversial. There's been a lot of scandals, there's been a lot of problems in the past. Minister Donoghue, I mean, Ireland has had its fair share of scandals in the past. How do you ensure public trust in this type of infrastructure investment? And are there ways to make sure that every bit of the money that's being spent is being spent well?
Well, governance is the crucial element of it. The quality of your institutions and those that are entrusted with leading them is the vital ingredient in these kind of debates. And you're right, of course, we have had challenges. We've also had examples of many projects and investment decisions that have gone well and made a very important contribution to our economy and to our society. And if I look at the issues that we are grappling with at the moment, we would have had many projects that deliver against the objectives that we set for them. But of course, as is the case at the moment, we would have projects that we would have areas of expenditure that there would be debate and scrutiny around. I think what we have learned from all of this and what we try to continue to focus on is firstly that we have clarity of oversight, and what we have now established in my own department is a central unit to look at how we can give clarity on what's going to happen when, and clarity regarding projected and expected cost. We then publish regularly an overall tracker for the country to allow our citizens to understand where key projects stand. And then finally, we're continually reviewing our public spending code to look at what we can learn both from difficulties and also from areas of investment that go well. It's understandable in democracies and with the focus that we have regarding the use of taxpayers' money that much of the debate will always be on what doesn't go well, as indeed your question to me touched on a moment ago. But as we acknowledge those, I think we have to make the case for public investment. We have to make the case for the difference that it can make to the lives of our citizens. And we have to know that that can play a role then in signalling and encouraging even higher levels of private sector investment.
Well, Director Alonso, you were previously Deputy Controller of the Budget, weren't you? And I believe you did some quite interesting work with external audits. How important is it to have external audits that are effective? And I mean, are there any lessons from Colombia?
Yes, thank you. And I think that there is two important issues. Of course, external audits is important, but it's more important the internal audits.
Internal audits?
Internal audits, because you have to take care, you have to pay attention what is happening inside before everything happens outside. So maybe I could say two things. The directors, the ministers, all the public servants should take really into account what they are doing in terms of what we can say managing an office as a private sector. In a private sector, you have to take into account the money that you're managing. And in a public sector, of course, you should do that. So the first thing is to take into account the internal auditing, to have strong rules about how the money and the process are going on. And you have to be more transparent. It's not just as a law that exists in the government, but a transparency inside of the entity is really important. The accountability also is an important issue. Not just for inside, but also for outsiders. And the capacity building. You have to always take into account, just as a country, what kind of people is managing the important offices in the government. But in the case of Colombia, we feel like we needed to work a lot in the capacity building, especially in the local governments, at the subnational levels. It was something that we saw every day in the fiscal controller offices, that at the capacity level, at the regional level, at the subnational level, is really weak. So we need to work a lot, helping that regions in managing the budget, in managing, in having a strong internal process to protect the public money. So this is a process where you have to rebuild every day, because if you got this transparency, if you got this confidence from the population, at the same time you will be able to attract them, and you will be able to get the tax payment culture, for example. Some of our problems in all our governments is that people, they prefer to don't pay taxes because they feel that the taxes disappear. So this is a kind of how to keep the culture in a positive way to strong the tax base. So we used to call it like a strong anti-corruption law, but I feel that what we need is a strong transparency politics in order to get back the confidence of the population and the private sector.
I mean, Vera, in Africa, that's a particularly big problem, isn't it, in terms of the lack of confidence in the use of public money. And I've seen figures suggesting, you know, a third of the infrastructure spending is being wasted in many of the developing countries. Do you have much confidence that it will be possible to do external audits effectively?
Yes.
Or internal audits?
I think there are a lot of internal audits get done, I think, in almost most of the countries on the continent, particularly because it's one of the IMF conditions for a lot of the reviews. I think the question is more what happens with those audits. Are they implemented? And I think, as Gloria was saying, are they put in the public domain? But again, just so that we don't lump everything into one category, I think we need to unpack a little bit where we are beginning to see, you know, use of public money for private gain, corruption in infrastructure projects. And there has been, I think, quite an improvement in the upfront phase of infrastructure procurement, because we're getting towards, I think, what you mentioned is a standardization process. Many countries now know how to do IPPs, we know the processes. Institutions like the IFC, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, EIB, have sort of been able to standardize those upfront processes. So we get to procurement, and then that's where you begin to get, and so this is an improvement, and this is a good thing, that we have through the stages of sort of the bid, the call for proposals, because we have a lot more assistance and a lot more clarity on project preparation, the cost and the corruption, and that has gone down. But then now it's in the project execution phase, and you mentioned that. So projects that are meant to be executed for 3 years end up being executed for 10 years. And that's where you start seeing, you know, project costs go up, the supervision on sort of the costs sort of gets taken off a little bit, and that's where internal audits become important. Because if you have a 5-year fiscal policy framework, you can then start asking questions about why is the project that was supposed to exit still in, and why are the costs going up rather than going down. And I think that is where then transparency comes in. I think on the continent now, in many countries, we are beginning to see civil society organizations that are now beginning to look at the procurement process. And while we have focused a lot on was there a bid, was there a tender, who won, there is a new emerging segment of civil society that is looking at, are we building the road? And we're learning from examples in the Philippines where you can take pictures of the road, you know, on the construction and sending it to the State House. So my sense is there is a lot of that happening. We now need to strengthen the judiciary and strengthening the implementation of the audit report. So I think in many countries on the continent, we're moving from normally either the head of state or the prime minister, head of government, has to officialize and authorize the release of the internal audit report, to saying if after 30 days you haven't signed it, just release it. And when you have those kinds of default mechanisms, you get a better process. We're getting there, but I also think we have to be realistic. A lot of the contracts that we do on the continent, there is a huge asymmetry of information, where, you know, the bidding, and I think the most famous discussion we're having now on the continent is Mozambique. You know, where you have private European bankers that come and sort of, you know, discuss with, you know, not well prepared government officials, and $2 billion gets moved around without sort of clarity of purpose or clarity of use. And I think we need to manage those on both ends of the process as well, to ensure that, you know, there's double accountability, not just on the continent, but also from our potential investors. We do want the investors, but we would love that when they come, there is a certain amount of transparency, openness, and hopefully good integrity in that process.
Well, certainly, you know, social media, internet does allow potentially more transparency, more citizen involvement in terms of monitoring these projects in a very interesting way. But Minister Duchovny, what about the question of future fiscal costs from public-private partnerships? Because you can have situations where it seems like private sector money is coming in and providing financing, and yet that leaves a future fiscal cost that actually is very unpleasant.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, we have to take care about that. In Argentina, the usage of PPPs is the way in which we are putting together our needs of rebuilding our infrastructure together with our need of bringing down our fiscal deficit. So it's a very important tool, but it has to be used wisely. We're very happy that we learned from the previous experiences of other countries. When we launched our PPP programs, we learned from the experience of Colombia, of the UK, so we didn't depart from zero. We generated a unit of PPP that acts as coordinator of all the PPP programs of the different ministries. So that generates a standardization that permits, for example, comparing the costs in all the areas of the government, diminishing the possibility of having inefficiencies, corruption. So it's, in our view, is working very well. And let me say that also speaking about austerity and investing in infrastructure, what we are doing is prioritizing where we spend. Because we don't have too much money. So one of the parts that we decided to spend was in sewage and water sanitation, in which we had, correct me, Minister Frigerio, who is here and who is leading this program. We had like 7 million people without being served, and after these first 4 years, 1 million or 800,000 people is receiving is being served by sewage and water sanitation. So it's a very big improvement that will continue. And in the past few decades, we have never seen an advance such like that. And we are also prioritizing also investment that has a lot of impact in our citizens. For example, the Metrobus, who is a rapid system of buses, is diminishing dramatically the time of commuting for the people commuting between the province of Buenos Aires and the city of Buenos Aires. We are elevating the railroads also so as to improve the velocity of commuting. Well, and there's also a lot of investment that is not being carried out with public funds, because we reviewed the framework under which all the utilities are working in Argentina. So under that new revised framework, they are, well, forced to invest. So a very important part of investments in Argentina now are carried out by the private sector. So the combination of revised frameworks, choosing the projects with higher social impact, using PPP is a good basket of tools that we are using.
Right. I'm going to turn to the audience for questions in just a second, but before I do, Managing Director, do you have any thoughts you want to share in terms of what you've heard before we turn to questions? Any thoughts about what the one thing that needs to be done or the one thing that needs not to be done?
I would say, first of all, don't forget that we at the IMF, we can help. So whether it's the PIMA that has been much celebrated, which has been used with equal success in Ireland or in Ghana, for instance. So it's not a category of countries product. It's one that cuts across any advancement. Second, think medium term. That applies to fiscal, that applies to projects. Third, macroeconomic stability, vitally important. I would say, you remember the bridge to nowhere?
Mm-hmm. Which particular bridge to nowhere? There have been many bridges to nowhere all around the world.
I think
I used to live in Japan, which is full of bridges to, to nowhere.
Well, you know, I have this fear sometimes when I talk to countries' authorities that they are so mesmerized and enthusiastic about new technologies that they are thinking about how new technologies are going to transform anything from retail to pharmaceutical products delivery to, you just name it. And then you start really looking at what is happening on the ground. And I remember vividly discussions with Rwanda entrepreneurs who were highly invested in new techs, and they were saying, yet, you know, there are many places where we simply cannot deliver because the last mile is not covered. So thinking high-tech, new tech is good, but let's not forget that low-tech is actually going to also matter enormously to leverage the high-tech investment. Third, and particularly in the context of the Pan-African free trade agreement, I think that countries and I'm thinking here clearly of sub-Saharan Africa, countries need to think on a regional basis as well. Because when you see those corridors of transportations, for instance, to have the interoperability between countries is actually going to support the potential for boosted growth that will and should result from the African free trade union that is now in place. So that's what I would suggest, and massive focus on governance, anti-corruption. We have numbers that are, you know, sort of in our face in terms of what can be gained out of good, solid governance, and you know, I don't want to mention the $1 trillion that has been flagged in the fiscal monitor. It's out there, but I'll mention another number actually. If you take the 25, if you take say from the least corrupt to the most corrupt countries, and obviously apologies, but we have to use sometimes third-party indicators, and we try to blend them so that we arrive at something that is as objective as possible. You have twice as much waste of resources in the most corrupt as opposed to the least corrupt. Now that gives you the magnitude of what can be leveraged by just improving the governance and making sure that the audit are in place inside, but also with the third parties' pair of eyes. So.
Sorry, Pascal, I see you wanted to add something before.
Just when the managing director there was talking about the potential for bridges to nowhere, it does strike me that I think at times there's a great enthusiasm for how we deliver new projects, and in accompanying that, we have to ensure we maintain focus on how we can maintain what is already built. And at times that is not as exciting as moving ahead with the new technologies or the new bridge or the new project. But how we can maintain a steady state equilibrium for what is there, I think is a very important signal to citizens regarding support for them. And this is where I do believe public-private partnerships can play an important role project by project. Because you asked a question there, Gillian, about the hidden budgetary cost in the future. But good PPPs fund the renewal of what they are building. And that is why I think they can play a role, but I think there should never be a default expectation that that will be a PPP or that will be an exchequer project. I think a healthy mix between both is valuable.
So it's about fixing old bridges as well. We have a few minutes for questions. It would be courteous but not compulsory to identify yourself, and please keep your comments or questions very, very short. We have the microphones. We have a question in the front row and then back there. So I think you have to stand up, sir, and then go to the microphone just behind you. In fact, yeah.
Go ahead.
why don't you start, and then we'll have it there. Yes.
Good morning, Madam Lagarde, ladies and gentlemen. Before I ask the question, let's give a hand to the most powerful, wonderful woman in the world. Let's give a hand to Madam Lagarde. And the rest of the speakers. Madam Lagarde, I come from the rural area. You've seen me here for over 10 years since you became the director. We have rural areas. As much as we are talking investing in people, high quality infrastructure, I focus on agriculture. I've told you this many, many times. Farmers, you see everybody here ate in the morning. Where did the food come from? They came from the farmers. And in Africa, it's the rural area that has infrastructure. So high quality, Chinese have done a lot of good work there, and then we have high quality. So what I'm saying, especially to the African led, we should never underestimate rural area, because that's where the farming is, which makes people eat. Let's look for investment. Really, it may not be billions of dollars, but we can make the roads from the rural areas to town, bringing food for people to eat like you, to look nice. So let's focus on rural areas. We know there's much money involved, right. But as you've been traveling to Africa, you go everywhere, you need to come to where I come from, in the rural area. And then, okay. Yes, so how we need this to be done. I don't have a question. I just wanted to say thank you to Madam Lagarde and to praise her and all of you speakers. But remember, don't forget, and that's how we will fight poverty. Poverty is there, we mentioned. Yeah. So thank you so much, Madam Lagarde, for your leadership.
Can I? Thank you so much, but I was going to actually mention one thing when Gillian asked me any additional thoughts, and that goes to your question. I would say to all policymakers, beware of the white elephant projects. You know, those huge, big things that are decided out of nowhere, very often in close to urban areas, and think of the irrigation projects that will actually go a much, much longer way into particularly the rural areas of many countries in Africa and in other places around the world. So white elephant projects, whenever I hear about it, I say, ooh, watch out.
So no more massive palaces. Question over there.
Or massive stadiums.
Or massive stadiums, yes.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for the insights. I'm Federico Galizia, Inter-American Development Bank. And I want to ask about infrastructure as an asset class, and in particular, the role of financial intermediaries, multiplicity of sources. For a pension fund, it's much easier to buy a bond in an infrastructure bank than 20 different bonds in several projects. So specialized intermediaries can be an aggregator and can be a jump starter for the asset class, private, public, and so forth. So if you have any comment on this, I'll appreciate to hear your views.
So should we be looking at pooled vehicles? Vera, do you want to?
I think that's a fantastic question, and really one of the things that we're beginning to do now is look precisely at that, because we're in some of the good countries almost looking at second generation investment. So, you know, the IPPs have been done, we have good energy projects, and countries are looking to do the second set. And what we are now trying to do is see if you can pool together all this good infrastructure investment and monetize it through into an asset class and through a particular pool. So, for example, now we're working with Africa 50, which is the sort of IFC arm of the African Development Bank, to help bring together in many countries. Senegal is one where we are looking at it. Benin is another one where, you know, they already had 6, 7 IPPs, and you can now sort of monetize that, put that in a particular vehicle, put it on the market, and use the resources from that to invest. They had 75% access to energy, and you can get to 100% access to energy and do some more other investment projects. And I think this is a really good way, and thank you for asking the question, because we're trying to get more countries. It's not just raising new capital, but this is the benefit of good investment. Once you have a good investment at entry, most of the sort of pension funds and investors don't want to take construction risk. And the benefit of post-construction risk is you have a good asset, you have a good rate of return, and there is more transparency on the asset. It's very easy to then put a vehicle together that can then sort of lift off that vehicle into a new bond. And I think as Africans continue and start doing more PPPs and more IPPs that are well done, we will be able to recycle investments and get new resources for investment. And I think we really want to thank, we were part of the B20 group that was working with Argentina, on this idea of infrastructure as an asset class, because the more we can pick up from it, then the more we can have these kinds of ideas that allow for better financing and investment into infrastructure on the continent. And it's good that Japan is taking sort of the idea forward in a good way.
I would just to add that, yes, it is very important to use the expertise of the MDBs in generating the correct projects. So you are very involved with the countries, you know which projects can be developed. So IDB, World Bank can play an important role and in generating the first part of the job, investing part of the balance sheet, and then leverage in the market the rest of the financing. So that's a way to enhance the investment in infrastructure.
Yeah, no, risk pooling and risk sharing and using the public sector to provide a wrap for investments in a way that will bring in and give guarantees to the private sector is certainly a fascinating area of discussion now. I think this will have to be the last question. I'm very sorry indeed, because we are almost out of time, but sir.
I just want to say thank you for a very insightful panel discussion. My question is about informality. You mentioned addressing, improving the tax base for many developing countries. I'm aware that especially in countries, African countries like where I come from, you have a lot of informality. There are a lot of people who are out of the formal system where you can get income tax or consumption tax, because retail is not as developed as what you would have in more developed countries. I just want to know if there's anything you're looking at or any research that has been done in addressing this particular issue. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you. It's two things. I think we need to agree that informality is not the norm, and then we need to try to move out of it. And I think over the course of the last few days, we're talking with one finance minister who said that he knows a private sector businessman who goes to the ports every day and sort of releases or gets out 7, 8, 9, 10 containers, but he's in the informal sector. I think we need to stop that, and we need to sort of understand how we broaden the base. But the reason why we have an informal sector is basically because the cost of formality is too high. And what does that mean? It means that the cost of paying taxes is too high, the cost of getting your goods out of the ports is too high, and it really comes down to how can you improve the business environment. Once you improve the business environment, you begin to shrink the informal sector. It is a question of the social contract. If you pay taxes and you don't get your water connected in time, or you don't get your energy connected in time, you go into the informal sector. So I think a lot of what we're trying to do is see, can you improve doing business? Can you improve the business environment? But more importantly, I think there is some work that is being done now that shows that if you can cluster SMEs, and Guinea is one of the countries that's doing this, cluster SMEs, and give them a certain list of basic things, registering their business as a one-stop shop. And then after 2 or 3 years, you start asking them, bringing them back into the tax bracket, you get that work being done. And you get a benefit of twofold. One, you enlarge in your tax base, but more importantly, you grow your SME sector. And you can actually use some of the resources from taxation to finance those SMEs so that they grow until they become sort of large enough sectors. So I think there is a lot of work that we're doing. It all starts with improving the business environment, and it all starts with working with, I think the lady talked about the rural areas, ensuring that the small and medium enterprises in the rural areas get the services that they deserve, and then we can go off and tax them. But I think the research around informality is consistent, that you get more informality where the business environment is not as good. And I think this is the gap that the MD was talking about, about corruption. And informality is a proxy in many places for corruption and the lack of just sort of clear and good institutional processes to perform a good business.
Right, well, thank you. Well, the fact we still have a number of questions which have not been asked, I apologize deeply. We are pretty much out of time, but the fact we do have questions shows what a hot topic this is right now. I take away sort of 3 key points. Firstly, the bad news is the financing gap for infrastructure is huge, and the ambitious SDG targets have really put that into focus about the amount of financing that's needed. The good news is that there is plenty of money in the world, even though it's all in the wrong places most of the time. And the fairly good news, just to be optimistic, is that there is now, in my view, a much more creative and intelligent discussion going on about how to actually get the money that's in the wrong place into somewhere near the right place going forward. And I do find it very encouraging that the range of different ideas that are being discussed and being put on the table, whether it's classic PPPs, whether it's ways of risk sharing, whether it's other ways of issuing bonds, trying to look at ways to actually get more private money into the public sector, working alongside the public sector, getting better tax revenue is obviously very important indeed, but also talking about ways to have better monitoring and governance is encouraging. And I'm also very encouraged by the thought that digital technology does allow us to not only share ideas, but improves oversight as well in a much more meaningful way. So plenty of huge challenges going forwards, but some very interesting ideas about how to try and meet them. So I just end by saying, good luck. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.